The smell of stale coffee and disappointment hung thick in the air of Murphy's Diner that Tuesday morning. I sat across from my father, watching him tear apart my life choices with the same methodical precision he used to clean his service rifle 30 years ago. His weathered hands gripped the ceramic mug like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality, knuckles white with frustration. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 28 years old, Sarah, he said, not bothering to look up from his black coffee. 28 years old, and what do you have to show for it? A string of failed jobs, maxed out credit cards, and now you're telling me you want to throw away the one stable thing you've got left. I picked at the corner of my napkin, feeling smaller with each word. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows across his disappointed face. This wasn't how I'd imagined telling him about my decision to leave my accounting position at Riverside Financial. I'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but sitting here now, watching his jaw clench with that familiar look of resignation, all my carefully planned words crumbled to dust. Dad, you don't understand. Don't understand? He finally looked up, his steel gray eyes cutting through me. I understand plenty, Sarah. I understand that your mother and I sacrificed everything to give you opportunities we never had. I understand that while other kids were playing video games, you were in advanced placement classes. I understand that we took out loans we couldn't afford to send you to college, and this is what we get in return. The diner around us buzzed with the usual morning crowd. Construction workers grabbed quick breakfasts before heading to job sites. Office workers checked their phones while waiting for orders. And somewhere in the background, the grill sizzled with the promise of fresh starts. But at our corner booth, time seemed frozen in this moment of reckoning. What my father didn't know, what I couldn't bring myself to tell him, was that everything was about to change in ways neither of us could imagine. The argument had started 3 days earlier when I'd finally worked up the courage to call him. I'd been putting it off for weeks, knowing exactly how he'd react to my news. Colonel James Morrison wasn't the type of man who understood career pivots or finding yourself. He understood duty, structure, and seeing things through to completion. The military had shaped him into someone who viewed life as a series of objectives to be accomplished, not explored. My childhood had been a series of relocations from base to base, each move another lesson in adaptation and resilience. Fort Bragg, Quantico, Peterson Air Force Base, then finally settling in civilian life when he retired in Phoenix. Mom used to joke that we'd lived in more states than most people visited, but there was always an underlying tension in her voice when she said it. Military families learn to pack light, both physically and emotionally. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, he'd said over the phone, using my full name the way he always did when disappointment crept into his voice. You cannot be serious about this nonsense. I'd been standing in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Denver, looking out at the mountains while trying to find the right words. The decision hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Working at Riverside Financial had been slowly suffocating me, each day blending into the next, in an endless cycle of spreadsheets and client meetings that felt increasingly meaningless. It's not nonsense, Dad. I've been thinking about this for months. I want to do something that matters, something that makes a difference. Making a difference? His laugh had been sharp, cutting. You think balancing books doesn't matter? You think helping people manage their finances isn't important? Sarah, you have a stable job with benefits, a 401k, and you're throwing it all away for what? Some fantasy about changing the world? The conversation had spiraled from there, each exchange more heated than the last. He'd brought up my failed attempt at graduate school, the marketing job I'd quit after 6 months, the brief stint trying to start a photography business that had drained my savings. Every misstep, every false start, every moment of uncertainty was cataloged and presented as evidence of my fundamental inability to commit to anything worthwhile. You're just like your mother, he'd said finally, and those words had hit harder than anything else. Always chasing after some perfect life that doesn't exist, never satisfied with what you have. I'd hung up on him then, something I'd never done before. The silence in my apartment had been deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic, and the sound of my neighbor's television through the thin walls. That's when I decided we needed to meet in person, to have this conversation face to face, away from the safety of phone lines and the temptation to simply hang up when things got difficult. Now sitting in Murphy's diner, I could see that nothing had changed. If anything, having 3 days to stew over our phone conversation had only hardened his position. The man across from me wasn't just my father anymore. He was Colonel Morrison, the officer who'd commanded respect from subordinates and peers alike, the leader who'd never backed down from a difficult decision or allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. "Do you remember what you told me when I was 8? I asked quietly, trying a different approach. We were at Fort Carson, and I'd gotten into trouble for starting a fight with Tommy Henderson. His expression softened slightly, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "You didn't start that fight. That boy was picking on Maria Santos because her English wasn't perfect." "Right. And you told me that sometimes doing the right thing means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something." "That's different, Sarah. That was about protecting someone who needed help." "How is this different?" I leaned forward, finally finding my voice. "I want to join the Peace Corps, Dad. I want to use my skills to help communities in developing countries manage their resources better, to teach financial literacy to people who've never had access to banking services." "How is that not standing up for people who need help?" His jaw tightened again, and I could see the internal battle playing out across his features. Part of him, the part that had raised me to care about others and fight for what's right, understood what I was saying. But the larger part, the part shaped by decades of military service and structured thinking, couldn't reconcile my decision with his definition of success and stability. "The Peace Corps," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "Sarah, that's not a career. That's not building a future. What happens when you come back in 2 years? You'll be 30, with no recent work experience, no connections in your field, starting over from scratch." "Maybe starting over isn't always a bad thing," I said. "Maybe sometimes you have to tear something down before you can build something better. That's exactly the kind of naive thinking that's gotten you into this mess." His voice was rising now, drawing glances from nearby tables. "Life isn't some grand adventure, Sarah. It's about making smart choices, building security, creating stability. Your mother learned that lesson too late, and I'll be damned if I watch you make the same mistakes." The mention of my mother hung between us like a landmine neither of us wanted to step on. She'd died 4 years ago, a victim of breast cancer that had been caught too late because she'd kept putting off medical appointments, always too busy chasing the next opportunity, the next chance to find fulfillment. Dad blamed her restless spirit for the delay in diagnosis, convinced that if she'd simply settled into a routine like he'd wanted, she would have caught it earlier. Mom was happy, I said softly. Even at the end, she was happy because she'd lived her life on her own terms. Your mother was irresponsible, he shot back, then immediately looked like he regretted the words. She was many things, Sarah, but practical wasn't one of them. And look where that got her. Look where that got us. The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered, and suddenly I understood that this conversation wasn't really about my career choices at all. It was about his fear of losing me the same way he'd lost her, about his desperate need to keep me safe and secure in ways he hadn't been able to protect my mother. I'm not Mom, I said gently, and I'm not going to disappear from your life because I choose a different path than the one you've mapped out for me. Aren't you? He pulled out his wallet and threw a 20 on the table, suddenly eager to end this conversation. Because, from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what you're doing. You're walking away from everything solid and real in favor of some romanticized notion of saving the world. He stood up, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. The morning sun streaming through the diner's windows caught the silver in his hair, highlighting how much he'd aged since Mom's death. The proud, confident man who'd once seemed invincible now looked tired, worn down by loss and disappointment. When this falls apart, he said, not quite looking at me, and it will fall apart, Sarah, because that's what happens when you build your life on good intentions instead of solid foundations. Don't expect me to pick up the pieces again. I can't keep watching you throw your life away, one bad decision at a time. He walked toward the door without looking back, leaving me alone in the booth with cold coffee and the weight of his words. Around me, the diner continued its morning rhythm, oblivious to the fact that my relationship with my father might have just cracked beyond repair. I sat there for another hour, replaying the conversation, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. The worst part wasn't his anger or his disappointment. It was the resigned sadness in his voice when he'd given up on trying to change my mind. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd truly failed him, not because of what I'd done, but because of who I was becoming. Little did I know that in less than a week, everything I thought I understood about failure, success, and my father would be turned completely upside down. The phone call that would change everything was still days away, and the revelation that would redefine my entire sense of self was waiting in the most unexpected place imaginable. The Peace Corps acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a postal worker who had no idea he was carrying the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with my father. I held the thick envelope in my hands, feeling its weight like a small bomb about to detonate my carefully constructed life in Denver. Congratulations, Sarah Morrison. You have been selected to serve as a community economic development volunteer in Guatemala. The words blurred together as I read through the assignment details. 2 years in a rural village called San Miguel Ixtahuacan, working with local cooperatives to establish sustainable microfinance programs. It was everything I'd hoped for and more, yet sitting alone in my apartment, I felt no joy, only a hollow ache where my father's approval used to live. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. 3 weeks passed before I worked up the courage to call him. 3 weeks of radio silence that stretched between us like an ocean neither of us seemed willing to cross. When I finally dialed his number, my hands shook as I waited for his voice. Sarah. His tone was flat, neutral, giving nothing away. I got accepted, I said simply. A long pause. Somewhere in the background, I could hear the television broadcasting the evening news. The familiar cadence of reporters discussing events that suddenly seemed trivial compared to the chasm opening between us. When do you leave? 6 weeks. There's training first in staging in Miami, then language immersion, then… 6 weeks. He cut me off. I suppose congratulations are in order then. The words hung between us, hollow and bitter. This wasn't how I'd imagined sharing the news. In my naive fantasies, he'd eventually come around, maybe even express pride in my decision to serve others. Instead, his congratulations felt like a funeral dirge for the daughter he'd thought he was raising. Dad, please. I know you're disappointed, but this is important to me. Can't you at least try to understand? Understanding and approving are 2 different things, Sarah. I understand that you've made your choice. I understand that nothing I say will change your mind. What I don't understand is why you're calling me if you've already decided my opinion doesn't matter. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I had made my decision, and I had known he wouldn't support it. But I'd called anyway, hoping for something I couldn't quite name. Forgiveness, maybe. Or acceptance. Or simply the comfort of knowing that despite everything, I was still his daughter. Your opinion does matter, I said quietly. It matters more than you know. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath his anger. Your mother used to say the same thing, right before she'd do exactly what she wanted regardless of what I thought. I loved her for it and hated her for it in equal measure. I'm not trying to hurt you. I know you're not. That's what makes this so damn frustrating. If you were being malicious or selfish, I could fight that. But you genuinely believe you're doing the right thing, and that makes it impossible to argue with you without feeling like I'm trying to crush your spirit. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in months, maybe years. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man behind the colonel, the father who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework, and sat beside my hospital bed when I'd had my appendix out at 14. What if I promised to be careful? I asked. What if I promised to check in regularly, to have emergency contacts, to… Sarah, you can't promise to control the uncontrollable. That's not how the world works, and you're old enough to know better. The conversation ended shortly after that, with polite exchanges about logistics and contact information that felt more like a business transaction than a family discussion. He didn't offer to help me pack. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He simply said goodbye and hung up, leaving me alone with the growing realization that this might be the last real conversation we'd have for a very long time. The training center in Miami was a whirlwind of orientations, medical briefings, and cultural preparation sessions that left little time for homesickness or regret. 67 volunteers from across the country gathered in conference rooms and dormitories, united by a shared desire to make a difference that our families and friends didn't always understand. During one of our evening sessions, a woman named Jennifer Chen sat beside me in the common area, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "You look like someone who's carrying the world on her shoulders," she said with a knowing smile. Jennifer was heading to Mongolia to work on sustainable agriculture projects, and something about her calm demeanor invited confidence. Before I knew it, I was telling her about my father, about his disappointment, about the weight of feeling like I'd failed the person whose approval mattered most. "My parents wanted me to be a doctor," she said when I finished. 5 years of medical school before I realized I was living their dream, not mine. When I told them I was dropping out to join the Peace Corps, my mother didn't speak to me for 8 months. 8 months? The thought of that much silence with my father made my chest tighten. Longest 8 months of my life. But you know what? When I finally came home from my first assignment in Botswana, she was waiting at the airport with tears in her eyes, telling me how proud she was of the work I'd done. What changed her mind? Jennifer smiled, gesturing toward a bulletin board covered with photos from previous volunteers. Pictures of schools being built, children learning to read, families celebrating successful harvests, evidence of lives changed and communities strengthened. She saw the letters I sent, the photos of the families I'd worked with, the difference we'd made in their village. She realized that her definition of success was too narrow, that maybe fulfillment and purpose mattered more than traditional achievement. I wanted to believe that my father might have a similar revelation, but the optimism felt fragile, easily shattered by the memory of his resigned disappointment. The flight to Guatemala City was turbulent, both literally and metaphorically. As our plane bucked through storm clouds over the Gulf of Mexico, I gripped the armrests and wondered if this was some kind of cosmic warning about the path I'd chosen. When we finally touched down, the humidity hit me like a physical force, and I realized there was no turning back now. San Miguel Ixtahuacan was a 3-hour bus ride from the capital, through winding mountain roads that offered breathtaking views of volcanic peaks and terraced hillsides. The village itself was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 1,500 people scattered across the mountainside in adobe houses with corrugated tin roofs. No traffic lights, no chain restaurants, no familiar anchors to the life I'd left behind. My host family, the Hernandezes, welcomed me with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold goodbye I'd received from my father. Maria Hernandez, a woman roughly my age with 3 young children, showed me to a small room with a single bed and a wooden desk that would serve as my home office. "Bienvenida, Sarah," she said, her English heavily accented but earnest. "We are happy you are here to help our community." The work began immediately. The existing microfinance cooperative was struggling with record-keeping and loan management, their ledgers maintained in a combination of Spanish and Quiche, the local Mayan language. My accounting background, the same skill set my father viewed as stability incarnate, suddenly became the foundation for genuine change. Within the first month, I'd helped establish a computer-based tracking system for loans and repayments. Within the second month, we'd expanded the cooperative's membership by 30%. By month 3, we'd secured a partnership with a fair trade coffee exporter that would provide sustainable income for dozens of families. The letters I sent home were filled with stories of small victories and gradual progress. I wrote about teaching Rosa Chiquin to use spreadsheet software, about helping the cooperative secure better prices for their coffee beans, about watching families move from subsistence farming to genuine economic stability. My father never wrote back. The silence stretched on for months, broken only by occasional texts that revealed nothing about his thoughts or feelings. "Received your letter, glad you're safe," or "Weather here is fine, hope you're well." Fragments of communication that felt more like proof of life than actual connection. It was Jennifer who finally convinced me to try a different approach. During one of our monthly volunteer gatherings in the regional capital, she pulled me aside after I'd spent yet another evening wondering aloud why my father couldn't acknowledge the impact I was making. "Maybe he doesn't know how to be proud of something he doesn't understand," she said. "Maybe he needs to see it through different eyes." "What do you mean?" "Write to someone else. Write to one of his old military buddies. Let them see what you're doing, and maybe they can help him understand." The suggestion seemed almost absurd at first. I barely knew any of my father's former colleagues, and the few I'd met at retirement parties and military gatherings had always seemed more interested in discussing deployment stories than current events. But the idea took root, growing stronger each day as my father's silence continued. I finally settled on Sergeant Major Robert Castellanos, a man who'd served under my father during their deployment to Afghanistan. He'd been at my mother's funeral, one of the few people who'd managed to coax something resembling a smile from my father during those dark weeks. If anyone could reach him, it might be someone who'd shared the bonds of military service. The letter I sent to Sergeant Major Castellanos was longer and more detailed than anything I'd written to my father. I told him about the cooperative, about the families I was working with, about the measurable impact we were making in the community. I included photos of the new computer lab we'd established, of children learning financial literacy, of farmers celebrating their first profitable harvest in years. I never expected him to write back. I certainly never expected him to show up in Guatemala. The day he arrived was like any other. I was working with Maria Hernandez on updating the cooperative's loan portfolio, when one of the children ran into our small office, chattering excitedly in Quiche about the strange man asking questions at the central market. "Gringo Grande," the boy kept saying. "Militar Gringo Grande." My Spanish was decent by then, my Quiche improving slowly, but the child's description sent a chill down my spine. A big American military man, asking questions about me specifically. I found him at Rosa Chiquin's coffee stand, sipping what had to be the strongest brew in the village while studying a worn photograph. Even in civilian clothes, his bearing was unmistakably military. Straight spine, alert eyes, the kind of controlled posture that comes from decades of training. "Sergeant Major Castellanos?" I approached cautiously, wondering if I was dreaming. He looked up, and his weathered face broke into a smile that reminded me suddenly of my father. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Sarah Morrison, as I live and breathe. What are you doing here?" "Your letter," he said simply, pulling the folded pages from his shirt pocket. "This letter changed everything." Sergeant Major Castellanos settled into the plastic chair across from me at Rosa's coffee stand, his presence commanding attention from every passerby in the market. Children stopped their games to stare at this imposing figure who clearly didn't belong in our mountain village, while vendors whispered among themselves in rapid Quiche, speculating about his purpose. "Your letter reached me 3 weeks ago," he began, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone I remembered from my father's military gatherings. "I've been thinking about it ever since, and frankly, it's been keeping me awake at night." I studied his face, searching for clues about his intentions. Had my father sent him? Was this some kind of intervention, a last-ditch effort to convince me to abandon my mission and return to the safety of American soil? "Did Dad ask you to come?" I asked directly, unwilling to dance around the obvious question. Castellanos shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your father doesn't know I'm here. Hell, your father doesn't even know I received your letter. But after reading it, after understanding what you've accomplished in this place, I had to see for myself." He pulled out a small digital camera, one of those rugged, military-grade devices designed to withstand harsh conditions. The screen displayed a series of photos that made my breath catch in my throat. "These pictures," he said, scrolling through images of the cooperative's computer lab, the expanded marketplace, families posing proudly beside newly constructed water filtration systems. "Where did you get these?" "I took them," I said, confused by his intensity. "I've been documenting our progress to include in my monthly reports to Peace Corps headquarters." "You took them." His voice carried a note of something I couldn't identify. Amazement? Recognition? Fear? "Sarah, do you remember your mother's maiden name?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Of course I do, Elizabeth Knox. Why would you ask something like that? Castellanos set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his hands remarkably steady for someone who'd just traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote village. What did your father tell you about your mother's family? Nothing really. She was orphaned young, raised by an aunt in Oregon who died before I was born. Mom never talked much about her childhood, said it was too painful to revisit. I felt a growing unease, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. Elizabeth Knox? He repeated, as if testing the weight of the name. Sarah, I need to show you something, but not here. Too many eyes, too many ears. Is there somewhere we can speak privately? The Hernandez family graciously offered their small courtyard for our conversation, understanding somehow that this wasn't a social visit. Maria ushered her children inside while her husband, Carlos, busied himself with evening chores that kept him conveniently out of earshot. Castellanos reached into his travel bag and withdrew a manila folder, its edges worn from handling. The contents, when he spread them across the wooden table, made no immediate sense to me. Military personnel files, commendation letters, deployment records, and at the center of it all, a photograph that made my world tilt on its axis. The woman in the picture wore the dress uniform of a U.S. Army general, 3 stars gleaming on her shoulders. Her face was older than any photo I'd seen of my mother, but the eyes were unmistakably familiar. The same green eyes that had looked back at me from mirrors my entire life. The same determined set to the jaw that my father always said I'd inherited. General Elizabeth Knox, Castellanos said quietly, retired 1987 after 25 years of distinguished service. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. Specialized in logistics and resource management, developed revolutionary supply chain protocols that are still used by the military today. My hands trembled as I picked up the photograph. This isn't possible. My mother was never in the military. She never mentioned anything about service, about rank, about any of this. Your mother was one of the most decorated female officers of her generation, Castellanos continued, his voice gentle but insistent. She served in Grenada, provided crucial support during the early stages of Operation Desert Shield. When she retired, she simply disappeared from military circles entirely. Changed her name back to her maiden name, moved to Oregon, started over completely. But why? Why would she hide something like this? Castellanos leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. That's a question only she could have answered. But I have theories, based on what I knew about her during our overlapping service. He pulled out another document, this one bearing official Department of Defense letterhead. The text was dense with military jargon, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Classified operations, national security implications, immediate reassignment recommended. Your mother was involved in something during her final deployment, Castellanos explained. Something that went sideways, though the exact details remain classified even today. There were questions about her decision-making, accusations of insubordination, political pressure from above. She could have fought it, could have demanded a court-martial to clear her name, but instead she chose to retire quietly. You think she was covering something up? I think she was protecting someone, maybe herself, maybe her unit, maybe people whose lives would have been destroyed if the truth came out. Elizabeth Knox was many things, but she was never a coward. If she walked away from everything she'd worked for, she had a damn good reason. The pieces of my mother's life that had never quite fit suddenly began forming a coherent picture. Her restlessness, her difficulty settling into civilian routines, her occasional use of military terminology that she'd quickly correct, the way she'd sometimes stare off into the distance as if seeing things the rest of us couldn't perceive. Does my father know? I asked. Your father met your mother 2 years after she retired. She told him she'd been a government clerk, working in supply management. Technically true, if you consider commanding logistics operations for an entire theater of operations to be clerical work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being criticized by my father for abandoning stable employment to pursue meaningful service, while my mother had hidden a distinguished military career that would have made him incredibly proud. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why travel all this way to share secrets that my mother obviously wanted to keep buried? Castellanos gestured toward the photos scattered across the table, images of the work I'd been doing in San Miguel Ixtahuacan. Because you're doing exactly what she did, Sarah. You're using organizational skills and resource management to transform communities, to create lasting change where it's needed most. You're displaying the same kind of leadership, the same strategic thinking, the same commitment to service that made your mother a legend in military circles. He pulled out his phone and showed me a video that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It was my father sitting in what looked like a VFW hall, surrounded by other veterans. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 weeks ago. My daughter's in Guatemala, I heard my father's voice say. Peace Corps volunteer, she's working with some cooperative, helping them manage their finances better. His tone was flat, almost apologetic, as if he was embarrassed by my choices. But then Castellanos fast-forwarded to another segment of the video, where my father was answering questions from the group. Is she making a difference? Someone asked off camera. My father's expression changed subtly, and for just a moment I caught a glimpse of something that might have been pride. She says they've increased their loan approval rate by 40%. Families that were barely surviving are now sending their kids to school, buying equipment, investing in their futures. Sounds like she's got her mother's head for logistics, another voice commented. Yeah, my father said quietly, yeah, she does. Castellanos turned off the video and fixed me with a steady gaze. Your father's been carrying around guilt about your mother for years, Sarah. Guilt about not understanding her restlessness, about not supporting her need to serve others, about the arguments they had when she wanted to volunteer for various causes after retirement. I don't understand. He sees you making the same choices your mother did, choosing service over security, and it terrifies him, not because he doesn't respect what you're doing, but because he failed to support her when she needed it most. He's afraid of making the same mistake twice. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I'd thought my father's opposition stemmed from disappointment in my choices. Instead, it came from his own regrets about failing to understand the woman he'd loved most. He needs to see what you've accomplished here, Castellanos continued. He needs to understand that your mother's legacy lives on through you, that the service she was denied after retirement is being fulfilled by her daughter. But why you? I asked. Why did you feel the need to personally deliver this information? Castellanos was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of my mother in her general's uniform. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories and carefully guarded secrets. Because I served under your mother during her final deployment. Because I was there when everything went to hell, when she made the decision that ended her career. And because I've spent the last 30 years wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Some way I could have helped her fight instead of walking away. He stood up slowly, gathering the documents and photos with practiced efficiency. Your mother saved lives, Sarah. More lives than you'll ever know. The operation that ended her career also prevented a humanitarian disaster that would have made international headlines. She took the fall so that others could continue serving, could continue protecting innocent people who never even knew they were in danger. And now? Now I'm going to do something I should have done 30 years ago. I'm going to make sure the people who matter understand exactly who Elizabeth Knox was and exactly what her daughter is accomplishing in her honor. Castellanos pulled out a satellite phone, one of those expensive devices that could connect to networks anywhere in the world. I'm calling your father, Sarah. I'm going to tell him everything, and then I'm going to put him on a plane to Guatemala so he can see for himself what kind of leader you've become. He won't come, I said automatically. He's too stubborn, too set in his ways. He'll come, Castellanos said with absolute certainty. Because I'm going to tell him something that will change everything he thinks he knows about duty, honor, and the legacy his wife left behind. As he dialed the number, I realized that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The father who'd called me a failure was about to learn that I carried the blood of a decorated general. The mother I'd thought I knew was about to be revealed as a military hero who'd sacrificed everything for the greater good. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I was about to discover that my own definition of success had been far too narrow, that the work I was doing in this remote mountain village was part of a legacy I'd never known existed. The phone call that would shatter my father's understanding of everything happened at dawn on a Tuesday Guatemala time. I stood beside Castellanos in the Hernandez courtyard, watching his weathered face as he waited for the connection to go through. The satellite phone's digital display showed the call routing through towers across 2 continents before finally reaching a familiar number in Phoenix. Jim? It's Bob Castellanos. His voice carried none of the casual friendliness I'd expected. Instead, it held the crisp authority of a man delivering critical intelligence. I'm in Guatemala, and I'm standing next to your daughter. We need to talk. Even from 3 feet away, I could hear my father's voice rising through the phone's speaker, a rapid-fire series of questions and demands that Castellanos answered with military precision. She's safe, she's healthy, and Jim, she's doing work that would make Elizabeth proud in ways you can't imagine. The mention of my mother's name seemed to cut through my father's agitation like a blade. I'm sending you photos and documents via secure email. Review them carefully, then call me back within the hour. What kind of documents? I heard my father ask, his tone shifting from anger to confusion. Military service records, classified mission reports, information about your wife that changes everything you thought you knew about duty and sacrifice. Castellanos paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Jim, Elizabeth Knox was one of the finest officers I ever served under. What your daughter is accomplishing here is a direct continuation of her mother's legacy. The line went quiet for nearly 30 seconds. When my father spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Elizabeth's maiden name was Knox. Yes, it was. And she was a hell of a lot more than the government clerk you believed her to be. Castellanos ended the call and immediately began uploading files to an encrypted server, his fingers moving across the satellite phone's interface with practiced efficiency. Each document transfer was accompanied by a soft chime that seemed to echo ominously in the morning air. He'll call back in 20 minutes, Castellanos said with absolute certainty. Your father is many things, but patient isn't one of them. The moment he opens those files, he'll want answers that only I can provide. While we waited, Castellanos told me stories about my mother that painted a picture completely different from the restless, unfocused woman my father had always described. In his version, Elizabeth Knox was a strategic genius who could coordinate supply lines across 3 countries simultaneously, a leader who inspired absolute loyalty from her subordinates, and an officer whose innovative approaches to resource management had revolutionized military logistics. During the Grenada operation, he said, settling back into his chair, we had a situation where medical supplies weren't reaching forward positions. 3 different units were reporting critical shortages, and conventional supply chains were failing due to damaged infrastructure. He pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketched diagrams. Your mother analyzed the problem for 6 hours straight, mapping every available route, every vehicle, every potential bottleneck. Then she commandeered a fleet of civilian fishing boats, coordinated with local fishermen who knew the coastal waters, and established a maritime supply line that no one had even considered. She saved the operation? I asked. She saved lives, Sarah. Dozens of wounded soldiers received treatment that wouldn't have been available otherwise. The medical corps sent her a formal commendation, calling her improvised supply network a masterpiece of creative logistics. The satellite phone rang exactly 19 minutes after Castellanos had ended the first call. This time, when he answered, my father's voice was completely different. Gone was the angry confusion, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. The Bronze Star citation, my father said without preamble. The one for exceptional service during classified operations. Bob, what the hell happened over there? That's not a conversation for open channels, Jim. But I will tell you this much. Your wife made a choice that ended her career, but prevented an international incident that could have destabilized an entire region. She took the blame for decisions that weren't entirely her own, because she understood that sometimes leadership means sacrificing yourself for the greater good. And Sarah? Castellanos looked at me, his expression softening slightly. Your daughter is displaying the same kind of strategic thinking, the same ability to see solutions where others see only problems. The microfinance program she's established here isn't just helping individual families. It's creating a sustainable economic foundation that will impact this community for generations. He described my work in military terms that I'd never considered. The loan tracking system became resource allocation optimization. The cooperative expansion was, quote, strategic partnership development. The community education programs were, quote, capacity-building initiatives. Suddenly, my Peace Corps service sounded like a military operation worthy of formal recognition. I want to see it, my father said finally. I want to see what she's built. Pack light and prepare for altitude, Castellanos replied. Guatemala City has direct flights from Phoenix twice weekly. I'll arrange ground transportation from there. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Word spread through San Miguel Ixtoacan that Sarah's father was coming to visit, and the entire community began preparing for what they seemed to consider a momentous occasion. Maria Hernandez insisted on preparing a feast, Carlos organized the men to make repairs to the cooperative's building, and even the children practiced greeting phrases in English. They think he's some kind of dignitary, I told Castellanos as we watched elderly women arranging flowers around the community center. Maybe he is, Castellanos replied cryptically. Maybe you both are, and you just never knew it. My father arrived on a Thursday afternoon, looking distinctly out of place in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, among the colorfully dressed villagers who had gathered to meet him. The mountain air at 8,000 feet elevation left him slightly breathless, and I could see him struggling to maintain his usual commanding posture. But it was his expression that caught my attention most. Gone was the disappointed resignation that had marked our last conversation in Denver. Instead, he wore the focused intensity of a man trying to reconcile conflicting intelligence reports. Sarah, he said simply when he reached me, and for the first time in months, my name didn't sound like an accusation. The tour of the cooperative began immediately. Carlos Hernandez, speaking careful English, supplemented by my translation, walked my father through every aspect of the operation. The computer lab, where loan applications were processed. The meeting room, where financial literacy classes were held. The secure office, where cash reserves were managed according to international banking standards. My father asked detailed questions about interest rates, default percentages, expansion projections, and risk management protocols. His inquiries had the precision of a military briefing, and I realized he was applying the same analytical framework he'd used during his decades of service. The loan approval process, he said, studying spreadsheets that displayed 6 months of cooperative data. You've increased approvals by 40% while actually reducing default rates. How is that possible? Better screening, I explained. Instead of just looking at collateral, we assess the applicant's social connections, their history of community involvement, their family stability. People who are invested in the community are more likely to honor their commitments. Social capital as a risk mitigation factor, he murmured, and I caught Castellanos nodding approvingly behind him. The revelation moment came during our visit to the expanded marketplace, where vendors who had received microloans were displaying their wares. Rosa Chiquin, whose coffee business had tripled in size thanks to cooperative funding, insisted on serving my father the same powerful brew she'd offered Castellanos days earlier. As she handed him the steaming cup, she spoke rapidly in Spanish, gesturing toward me with obvious pride. My father's Spanish was limited, so I began to translate. She says the señorita has changed everything for her family. Her oldest daughter is in university now, studying to be a teacher. Her son has new equipment for his farming. She says, but Rosa wasn't finished. She continued speaking, her voice rising with emotion, and suddenly she said something that made every conversation in the marketplace stop. Ella es como una general, Rosa declared, pointing directly at me. Una general que lucha por su pueblo. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children stopped their games, sensing that something significant had just occurred. My father set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his eyes fixed on Rosa's face. What did she say? He asked quietly. She said I'm like a general, I replied, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. A general who fights for her people. That's when Castellanos stepped forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet marketplace. Colonel Morrison, he said, using my father's old rank for the first time since his arrival, I'd like you to meet General Knox. The words hung in the air like a challenge, impossible to ignore or misunderstand. Every person in the marketplace turned to stare at me, and I felt the weight of expectations I'd never known existed settling on my shoulders. My father looked from Castellanos to me and back again, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been wonder. "General Knox," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of the words. "She's been leading without rank, commanding without authority, achieving strategic objectives through pure force of character and intelligence," Castellanos continued. "Just like her mother did before politics and bureaucracy forced her out of uniform." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, sensing drama even if they couldn't understand the English being spoken. But Rosa Chiquin, who had sparked this moment with her spontaneous declaration, stepped forward and spoke again. "Sigh," she said firmly, looking directly at my father. "Su hija es una general sin uniforme, pero una general." This time my father understood without translation. "Your daughter is a general without a uniform, but a general nonetheless." He stood there in that mountain marketplace, surrounded by people whose lives had been transformed by his daughter's work, and for the first time since I'd known him, Colonel James Morrison looked like he was struggling to maintain his composure. "She gets it from her mother," he said finally, his voice thick with emotions I couldn't identify. "No, sir," Castellanos replied with absolute conviction. "She gets it from both of you. The strategic mind comes from Elizabeth, but the determination to see a mission through regardless of personal cost? That's pure Morrison's stubbornness. And that's when my father did something I'd never seen before in my entire life. Standing in a marketplace 8,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by Guatemalan villagers who had just declared his daughter a general, Colonel James Morrison began to cry. The tears that rolled down my father's weathered cheeks reflected decades of suppressed grief, pride, and revelation. In that bustling Guatemalan marketplace, surrounded by vendors whose lives had been transformed through microfinance initiatives I'd helped establish, Colonel James Morrison finally understood the true weight of legacy. Rosa Chiquin approached him with the gentle confidence of someone who had witnessed transformation firsthand. She pressed a small, wrapped package into his hands, speaking softly in Spanish while maintaining steady eye contact. Her words carried the musical cadence of someone sharing sacred knowledge. "Esto es para usted," she said, then switched to careful English. "For the father of our general." My father unwrapped the gift with trembling fingers, revealing a hand-carved wooden figurine depicting a woman in military dress, her arms outstretched toward a group of children. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail etched with obvious care and reverence. "Local artisan made this," Rosa explained through my translation. "He says your daughter reminds him of stories his grandmother told about women who protected villages during the Civil War, strong women who fought without weapons, who built instead of destroyed." Castellanos stepped closer, examining the figurine with the appreciation of someone who understood military symbolism. "The pose," he observed. "She's not holding a weapon or giving orders. She's offering protection through service." "Just like Elizabeth," my father whispered, his voice barely audible above the marketplace chatter that had gradually resumed around us. The rest of that day unfolded like a carefully orchestrated briefing, except instead of military personnel delivering reports, it was cooperative members sharing testimonials about sustainable development and economic empowerment. Each story built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of systemic change that had rippled throughout the entire region. Carlos Hernandez walked us through the expanded computer lab, where teenagers were learning spreadsheet applications that would prepare them for administrative positions in regional businesses. The irony wasn't lost on me that these young people were mastering the same basic accounting principles my father had once dismissed as insufficient foundation for meaningful work. "Before Señorita Sara," Carlos explained in English that had improved dramatically since my arrival, "our children had two choices after school: farm work or migration to Guatemala City. Now they have a third choice: professional work here in their home community." My father examined the computer screens displaying loan portfolios, repayment schedules, and profit projections with the intensity of someone reviewing strategic intelligence. His questions became increasingly sophisticated as he grasped the complexity of what we'd built together. "The risk assessment matrix you've developed," he said, pointing to a chart that tracked social, economic, and geographic factors influencing loan success. This is more comprehensive than systems I've seen in major banks. It has to be, I replied. Traditional banking metrics don't account for community resilience, extended family support networks, or seasonal agricultural variations. We had to create new evaluation criteria that reflected actual local conditions. Castellanos had been observing this exchange with obvious satisfaction, occasionally nodding as if confirming predetermined expectations. When we paused for coffee at Rose's expanded stall, he finally voiced what I suspected he'd been thinking since his arrival. "Colonel Morrison," he said formally, "I believe it's time we discussed your daughter's future beyond this current assignment." The words carried implications that made my stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. For 8 months, I'd been completely immersed in the immediate challenges of community development, rarely considering what would happen when my Peace Corps commitment ended. "What kind of future?" my father asked, his tone shifting into the careful neutrality he used when gathering intelligence. "The kind that honors both her mother's legacy and her own demonstrated capabilities," Castellanos replied. "Sarah has proven she can design, implement, and manage complex economic development programs under challenging conditions. Those skills don't have to disappear when she returns to civilian life." He pulled out a tablet device and showed us a website I'd never seen before. The International Development Consulting Group, a private organization that contracted with governments, NGOs, and international agencies to provide expertise in post-conflict reconstruction and sustainable development. "They've been following your work through Peace Corps reports and regional coordinator recommendations," Castellanos explained. "The expansion model you've developed here in San Miguel Ixtahuacan is being studied as a potential template for similar communities throughout Central America." The website displayed project descriptions that made my current assignment seem almost modest by comparison. Post-earthquake reconstruction in Haiti, agricultural modernization programs in sub-Saharan Africa, microfinance network development across Southeast Asia. Each initiative required the same combination of strategic planning, resource management, and community engagement that had defined my work in Guatemala. "They want to offer me a position?" I asked, hardly believing such opportunities existed outside military or government service. "They want to offer you a career," Castellanos corrected. "Project leadership positions that would utilize your accounting background, your demonstrated ability to build community partnerships, and your talent for creating sustainable economic systems." My father had been studying the tablet screen with growing intensity, his expressions cycling through surprise, calculation, and something that looked suspiciously like pride. "The compensation package," he said, pointing to salary ranges that were significantly higher than anything I'd ever imagined earning. "This is senior management level." "Because the work requires senior management capabilities," Castellanos replied. "Sarah has spent 8 months proving she can lead complex initiatives in challenging environments. Most consulting firms spend years training personnel to handle assignments like this." That evening, the Hernandez family hosted a farewell dinner that felt more like a military promotion ceremony. Community leaders gathered in their small courtyard, sharing stories about specific ways the cooperative expansion had impacted their families. Each testimonial felt like a commendation being read into the official record. "My grandson will attend university," announced elderly Miguel Santos, whose coffee farm had tripled its revenue through cooperative marketing initiatives. "First in our family ever to receive higher education. This happened because Señorita Sara showed us how to organize our resources effectively." "My daughter opened her own bakery," added Elena Morales, whose microfinance loan had enabled her to purchase commercial baking equipment. "She employs 4 other women now. Their families have steady income for the first time in years." The stories continued late into the evening, each one documenting measurable improvements in education access, healthcare availability, agricultural productivity, and economic stability. What struck me most was how these individual successes had created network effects throughout the community, generating opportunities and improvements that extended far beyond the original cooperative membership. My father listened to each testimonial with the focused attention of someone conducting after-action reviews. Occasionally, he would ask specific questions about implementation challenges, resource constraints, or scalability factors. His inquiries revealed a strategic mind assessing not just what had been accomplished, but how these methods might be applied in other contexts. The training protocols you developed for financial literacy education, he said during a brief pause in the testimonials. How transferable are they to communities with different cultural backgrounds? The basic principles are universal, I replied, but the delivery methods have to be adapted to local communication styles, educational traditions, and social hierarchies. What works in rural Guatemala might need significant modification in urban Africa or coastal Asia. Adaptability under changing conditions, he murmured, and I recognized the phrase from military leadership manuals he used to study when I was a child. Castellanos raised his beer bottle in a toast that seemed to crystallize the entire evening's significance. To General Knox, he said solemnly, who proved that leadership doesn't require rank, that command doesn't need authority, and that the greatest victories come from empowering others to succeed. The gathering responded with enthusiastic agreement, glasses and bottles raised toward the star-filled sky above our mountain village. But it was my father's response that mattered most to me. To my daughter, he said, his voice steady and clear, who finally helped me understand what your mother was trying to tell me all those years. The next morning brought departure preparations that felt surprisingly similar to military redeployment procedures. Equipment needed to be transferred to local management, documentation had to be completed for Peace Corps archives, and transition briefings were scheduled with incoming volunteers who would continue supporting the cooperative's expansion. My father insisted on participating in these handover activities, applying his own experience with command transitions to ensure continuity of operations. His suggestions for documentation standards and accountability measures impressed the Peace Corps regional coordinator, who commented that she'd rarely seen such thorough preparation for volunteer departure. Your daughter has established something remarkable here, she told my father during our final administrative meeting. The cooperative model she's developed is being studied by development economists as a potential template for rural economic empowerment programs throughout Latin America. She gets that from her mother, my father replied, and for the first time those words carried pride instead of resignation. The flight back to Guatemala City was subdued, each of us processing the implications of everything that had transpired over the past week. My father spent most of the journey reading through files Castellanos had provided about international development opportunities, occasionally asking questions about specific organizations or project requirements. The consulting position, he said as our plane began its descent toward the capital. When would they want you to start? 6 weeks, I replied. Time to complete Peace Corps debriefing procedures and prepare for the next assignment. Which would be where? I showed him the preliminary project description that had arrived via encrypted email the previous evening. Post-conflict economic reconstruction in Sierra Leone, working with local communities to rebuild agricultural cooperatives destroyed during years of civil war. The challenges would be significantly more complex than anything I'd faced in Guatemala, but the fundamental objectives remained the same: empowering communities to achieve sustainable economic independence. Sierra Leone, my father repeated thoughtfully. That's serious work, Sarah. Dangerous work. Yes, it is, I agreed. But it's also necessary work. Work that makes a difference in ways that traditional jobs never could. He was quiet for several minutes, staring out the airplane window at volcanic peaks disappearing beneath cloud cover. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Your mother used to say that safety was an illusion, that the only real security came from knowing you'd spent your life doing something that mattered. He turned to look at me directly. I spent so many years trying to protect you from the uncertainty she embraced, that I forgot to consider whether that uncertainty might be exactly what you needed. The conversation continued during our layover in Guatemala City, where we had several hours before connecting flights would take us to different destinations. My father would return to Phoenix, while I headed to Washington's 600th for Peace Corps debriefing and preparation for my next assignment. I want to apologize, he said as we sat in the departure lounge surrounded by travelers heading to various international destinations. For not understanding what you were trying to accomplish. For not recognizing that your choices weren't rejection of everything I'd taught you, but application of those lessons in ways I'd never considered. You don't need to apologize, I replied. You were trying to protect me from making what you thought were mistakes. Maybe, but I was also trying to protect myself from confronting truths about your mother that I wasn't ready to face. He pulled out the wooden figurine Rosa had given him, studying its carved features in the fluorescent airport lighting. She tried to tell me about her military service once. Early in our marriage, I thought she was fantasizing, creating elaborate stories to make her government clerk position sound more interesting. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. She tried to tell you the truth? Multiple times. But I was so convinced I knew who she was, so determined to believe my own version of her story, that I dismissed everything that didn't fit my preconceptions. His voice carried decades of regret. I spent our entire marriage thinking I was married to someone who couldn't settle down, who couldn't commit to anything long-term. I never realized I was married to a decorated general who had sacrificed her entire career for principle. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching planes taxi across runways toward destinations that would have seemed impossibly exotic just a few years earlier. The International Departure Lounge felt like a metaphor for the crossroads where we both found ourselves. "The consulting work," my father said eventually. "It's not going to be easy. International development is complicated, politically sensitive, sometimes dangerous." "I know," I replied. "But it's also exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." He nodded slowly, his expression shifting into the focused determination I remembered from my childhood whenever he faced difficult command decisions. "Then you're gonna need support, professional references, security briefings, emergency contacts." He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts accumulated over decades of military service. "I know people in Defense Department contracting, State Department regional offices, private security firms that specialize in protecting development workers." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted firmly. "Your mother served without support from home, without someone advocating for her interests, making sure she had resources she needed to succeed. I failed her in that regard, but I'm not going to fail you." The boarding announcement for my Washington flight interrupted our conversation. But as I gathered my luggage, my father handed me a business card I'd never seen before. "Robert Castellanos, Senior Partner, Strategic Development Solutions," I read aloud. "He's starting his own consulting firm," my father explained, "specializing in post-conflict reconstruction and sustainable development. He wants you as his first senior associate." The implications were staggering. Instead of joining an established organization as a junior consultant, I would be helping build a new firm from the ground up, with partnership track opportunities and project leadership responsibilities that typically required years of experience to achieve. "But I've only been doing this work for 8 months, I protested. "You've been preparing for this work your entire life," my father replied with absolute conviction. "The strategic thinking, the resource management skills, the ability to adapt under pressure, those aren't things you learned in Guatemala. Those are things you inherited from your mother and refined through your own experience." As I walked toward the departure gate, my father called out one final time, "Sarah." I turned back to see him standing ramrod straight, his hand raised in a formal military salute. "Give him hell, General Knox." 3 months later, I stood in the departure lounge at Dulles International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Freetown, Sierra Leone. My luggage contained equipment for establishing microfinance cooperatives in post-conflict communities, along with security protocols and emergency communication devices that reflected the serious nature of the work ahead. The past 12 weeks had been a whirlwind of briefings, training sessions, and preparation activities that had transformed me from Peace Corps volunteer to senior international development consultant. Castellanos had been true to his word, offering partnership opportunities and project leadership responsibilities that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My father had been instrumental throughout the transition, leveraging his network of military contacts to arrange security briefings, cultural orientation sessions, and professional introductions that would have taken years to develop independently. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like we were working toward the same objectives, instead of fighting about fundamental life direction. The boarding announcement echoed through the departure lounge, calling passengers for the first leg of a journey that would take me halfway around the world to communities still recovering from years of devastating conflict. The challenges would be significantly more complex than anything I'd faced in Guatemala, but I felt prepared in ways that extended far beyond professional training. As I walked toward the gate, I thought about my mother, General Elizabeth Knox, and the decorated military career she'd sacrificed for principles I was only beginning to understand. I thought about my father, who had finally learned to see strength in choices he'd once considered weakness. And I thought about Rosa Chiquin and the dozens of other community members in San Miguel Ixtahuacan who had declared me a general without uniform, a leader whose authority came from service rather than rank. The airplane engines roared to life as we taxied toward the runway, carrying me toward a future that would have been unimaginable just 1 year earlier. Through the small window, I watched the lights of Washington, D.C. disappear beneath clouds, knowing that somewhere below, my father was probably tracking my flight status and calculating arrival times in Sierra Leone. For the first time in my life, I understood that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, one decision at a time, one community at a time, one life at a time. My mother had built her legacy through military service and personal sacrifice. My father had built his through dedication to duty and protection of others. Robert Castellanos, Senior Partner, Strategic Development Solutions, I read aloud. He's starting his own consulting firm, my father explained. Specializing in post-conflict reconstruction and sustainable development, he wants you as his first senior associate. The implications were staggering. Instead of joining an established organization as a junior consultant, I would be helping build a new firm from the ground up, with partnership track opportunities and project leadership responsibilities that typically required years of experience to achieve. But I've only been doing this work for 8 months, I protested. You've been preparing for this work your entire life, my father replied with absolute conviction. The strategic thinking, the resource management skills, the ability to adapt under pressure, those aren't things you learned in Guatemala. Those are things you inherited from your mother and refined through your own experience. As I walked toward the departure gate, my father called out one final time, "Sarah." I turned back to see him standing ramrod straight, his hand raised in a formal military salute. "Give 'em hell, General Knox." 3 months later, I stood in the departure lounge at Dulles International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Freetown, Sierra Leone. My luggage contained equipment for establishing microfinance cooperatives in post-conflict communities, along with security protocols and emergency communication devices that reflected the serious nature of the work ahead. The past 12 weeks had been a whirlwind of briefings, training sessions, and preparation activities that had transformed me from Peace Corps volunteer to senior international development consultant. Castellanos had been true to his word, offering partnership opportunities and project leadership responsibilities that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My father had been instrumental throughout the transition, leveraging his network of military contacts to arrange security briefings, cultural orientation sessions, and professional introductions that would have taken years to develop independently. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like we were working toward the same objectives, instead of fighting about fundamental life direction. The boarding announcement echoed through the departure lounge, calling passengers for the first leg of a journey that would take me halfway around the world to communities still recovering from years of devastating conflict. The challenges would be significantly more complex than anything I'd faced in Guatemala, but I felt prepared in ways that extended far beyond professional training. As I walked toward the gate, I thought about my mother, General Elizabeth Knox, and the decorated military career she'd sacrificed for principles I was only beginning to understand. I thought about my father, who had finally learned to see strength in choices he'd once considered weakness. And I thought about Rosa Chiquin and the dozens of other community members in San Miguel Ixtahuacan who had declared me a general without uniform, a leader whose authority came from service rather than rank. The airplane engines roared to life as we taxied toward the runway, carrying me toward a future that would have been unimaginable just 1 year earlier. Through the small window, I watched the lights of Washington, D.C. disappear beneath clouds, knowing that somewhere below, my father was probably tracking my flight status and calculating arrival times in Sierra Leone. For the first time in my life, I understood that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, one decision at a time, one community at a time, one life at a time. My mother had built her legacy through military service and personal sacrifice. My father had built his through dedication to duty and protection of others. Now it was my turn to build something worthy of the Knox Morrison name, something that would honor both the decorated general who had come before me and the colonel who had finally learned to support the mission. As our plane climbed through 30,000 feet, heading toward the challenges and opportunities waiting in West Africa, I smiled at the reflection staring back at me from the cabin window. General Knox was finally reporting for duty. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.